So the last section here, in the Living Environment Regents curriculum, this is broken out as sort of a separate unit. I usually just include it as part of ecology. So the last section is about how humans affect the environment. And so that's obviously linked closely with ecology. Humans are part of the ecosystem. Like all organisms, humans affect their ecosystems, but there are some unique things about humans that allow our impacts to be even greater. So this is all about how humans impact. I like this unit. I was an environmental studies major, so this is right up my alley. So all organisms, we just talked about ecology. We know all organisms have some impact on their ecosystem, on other organisms, on the non-living factors, but humans have sort of an outsized effect on their ecosystems, okay, for a couple of reasons. One is that humans have the ability to alter their environment to a greater degree than any other species. Some species have a big, like for example, a beaver has a huge impact. It can turn a stream ecosystem into a lake ecosystem, completely affecting the surrounding vegetation and plants and animals. So that's a big impact, but humans can do much more. Humans can take an ecosystem that would be inhospitable to us living there. Let's say the desert. Right? Pretty difficult for humans to live in the desert with lack of water and extreme temperatures and so forth. But we can use technology to bring water in from another area. We can build buildings and air conditioning units to make temperature more manageable. We can build a city like Las Vegas of millions of people in the middle of the desert. So we can drastically alter the natural ecosystems. And so that's one reason we have such a huge effect on the environment. The other is in terms of population growth. Humans have a very high population growth and very intense resource usage. We can sort of trace back most of our environmental issues to the size of the human population. If we look at the graph, this is in the last 10,000 years or so. So since the agricultural revolution, humans started, planting crops and so forth rather than hunting and gathering. Human population grew, but at a steady rate over time. A little dip there during the time of the plague, but that's sort of just not extreme growth. But then we get to modern times, and for the reasons that we just talked about, we have population growth change into exponential growth. So we have this rise in population. Again, we're well above this now. This graph, the population today would be off of this graph. And it's because of those things we talked about: medical advances, vaccines, sanitation, antibiotics allow humans to live longer and for more infants to survive than in the past. And so as we add more people to the earth, humans use resources. Some humans use a lot more resources than others. So depending on the area which a person is born, often that is related to how many resources they use. For example, here in the United States, one single individual uses a huge amount of resources. We have big houses, and we all drive cars, and we have lots of gadgets and so forth. In other parts of the world, people are living a subsistence life where they're basically using enough resources to stay alive and not much more. But as we add more and more people, we use more of these resources, so we have a greater impact on the environment. And so that leads us to the question, well, what is the carrying capacity of the Earth? So do we seem to have reached it yet, knowing what we know about population growth? No, because what would we expect once we do reach the Earth's carrying capacity? Yeah, we would expect a drop, right? If we follow a population, it grows until it's reached the carrying capacity of that ecosystem, and then it comes down and stays around that area of the carrying capacity. So the question is, what is the carrying capacity of the Earth? And we don't really know. Again, because of some of the features, we can alter the environment, we could take resources, natural resources from the ground. We don't know what it is, but if we do exceed it, then that means trouble. So the things we take from the Earth, we call them natural resources, and we can sort of split them into two main categories, renewable and non-renewable resources. Meaning renewable, things that are replaced over the short term, things that can be reused, things that don't get used up. So we can grow crops in the same field for many years, and we consider that a renewable resource. We talked about the water cycle in our last section. Okay? Water is renewable. Water doesn't get used up. It cycles through various organisms, various sources. Wind, the sun, these are renewable resources. They don't get used up. We also use many non-renewable resources. These are things that are not going to be replenished in the short term. Things like metals we take out of the ground. We take platinum out of the ground and use it, it's gone. It's not going to be form again in the ground. If we take coal, dig it out of the ground, use it, burn it, it's not coming back. And so those resources are non-renewable. If we look at and talk about a few of these, many of these resources we use to generate electricity, for power, to keep homes, power cell phones, computers, and so forth. So we can get that electricity in a variety of ways. One way that you are familiar with, I'm sure, are wind turbines. So we have them around here. We live in a pretty good area in terms of wind turbines. We have wind, we have lots of hills and ridges where you have windy areas. You'll see them around here if you drive south of New Hartford, like around Waterville and Madison County. You'll see up along the ridge lots of these wind turbines. You'll see them up north, you'll see them out near Herkimer. So they're all over the place. There are proposals to build more and more offshore. So like in Cape Cod, there's a proposal where they should build a bunch of these wind turbines off the shore a little ways, because those areas have almost constant wind, so they'd be very efficient there. Some people make the argument that then they are interfering with like the view of the ocean that people have there, and they don't like them for those reasons. But anyway, wind turbines are renewable. If you put up a whole bunch of wind turbines, it's not like, well, you're using up all the wind and tomorrow it's not going to be windy because you have too many wind turbines. This is just a natural feature. It's a renewable source. Hydropower is really important for us. We have a lot of much of our electricity in New York State comes from hydroelectric power. So if you build a hydroelectric facility, you're basically using moving water to spin a turbine to generate electricity. But you're not actually using up the water. You're sort of using the motion of the water to generate electricity. So that's a renewable resource. There's small hydroelectric plants. There's large ones like in Niagara Falls. They have a really big one. If you ever visited the Hoover Dam, another huge one. So they can vary in scale. But these are renewable sources of energy. Photovoltaic cells take solar energy, turn it into electricity. But you're not using up the sun. It's not like it's going to be less sunny tomorrow because we have too many solar panels out. And these solar panels are becoming more and more common. So I just was at, like I said, my daughter's graduation in Massachusetts, and along the Mass Pike, the exits to get on a highway, those big loops sort of, and wherever you had those, they have all solar panels in that sort of space that's in between the loops. And you see them on houses more frequently. Even Tesla, the car company, is making a new type of solar cell that looks like shingles that you would put over an entire roof. You wouldn't really know that it is a solar cell, but they're getting into that industry as well. So these generate electricity. Energy from within the earth can even be harnessed to heat renewable house and to generate electricity. It's called geothermal. Non-renewable sources, things like coal. To get coal, you have to dig it out of the ground. It contains a lot of energy. It's used often in power plants. If an area has like large deposits of coal in that area, they may have a lot of power plants that run on coal. Oil that you pump out of the ground, another fossil fuel. Natural gas that you pump out of the ground. These are all non-renewable. Once you take a ton of coal out of the ground and burn it, it's gone. It's not going to be reformed. What's the other big difference between these non-renewable sources of energy and the renewable sources? Besides the fact that they don't get used up, there's another important difference. Dean?
All the renewable ones are clean energy, and all the non-renewable ones are.
Yeah, in terms of pollution. Wind turbine produces, when it's in action working, produces no pollution. Right? Same thing, photovoltaic cells. There's no combustion. There's no burning of anything once these panels have been produced. And so there's no emissions in terms of carbon dioxide or other pollutants. Burning fossil fuels, these non-renewable resources, does provide a large amount of energy, but it also releases huge amounts of carbon dioxide and other pollutants. All right, so we're going to talk about kind of four categories of environmental issues here. Today we'll talk about species extinction. We'll go from there. So we know in recent research paints an even bleaker picture of species extinction, that huge numbers of species are becoming endangered and extinct throughout the world. And most of this is due to human activity. So we'll talk about, well, how do humans cause species to become extinct? Well, there's a variety of ways. So one is sort of probably the least common, is by actually humans killing a specific organism until they're all gone. The term used for that is direct harvesting. So some famous examples of this, passenger pigeons. Passenger pigeons, there were billions of them in North America. They were hunted for sport around in the 1800s, and they were hunted until they were completely gone. They're extinct. No longer any passenger pigeons. They were hunted to extinction. Another endangered species, elephants are endangered, mostly due to human hunting. Why do humans hunt elephants?
Ivory.
Yeah, ivory. So ivory, which are what elephant tusks are made out of, very valuable. People like to make jewelry and carve things out of it. It's traded. And so people kill elephants basically just for the ivory. And elephant populations severely damaged due to that hunting. The dodo bird, an example of a flightless bird that lived in a small island near Madagascar off the coast of Africa. And dodo birds were hunted to extinction by humans as well. They lived in an area, they evolved away from humans, so they had no natural fear of humans. So people could just sail up in the island and dodo birds would not be afraid, and they could easily be hunted. And they were hunted to extinction. There's no more dodo birds anymore. But that's sort of the minority of species extinction happen because humans are actually killing that organism. Many times this next two are important. So one is our use of various chemicals like pollutants, PCBs, DDT, pesticides, herbicides. When we use these chemicals, in agriculture or whatever, what happens is they can go through this process called biomagnification. So when we get a pollutant, like let's say PCBs is this example, into the water, tiny little plants that take it up, they take up a small amount of these PCBs, these pollutants, or it might be lead or mercury. But then the next trophic level, the herbivores that eat those, well, they eat a whole bunch of these microscopic organisms. So all of the lead or PCBs that was in those organisms then ends up in a single, okay, herbivore. And then the next trophic level, they eat a bunch of those herbivores. Now they're accumulating even more of it. And so every step up the food chain, the concentration of these toxins builds up in the tissue of those organisms. And so it affects those organisms high up on the food chain to a greater level than the organisms smaller that are lower on the food chain. This is one of the reasons why, for example, they advise pregnant women not to eat certain types of fish because they're high in the trophic levels. They can have high levels of heavy metals and toxins in them. Like pregnant women are supposed to limit the amount of salmon and tuna and other large carnivore fish that they eat. And the other factor is land use. So humans, we know there's, 7.5 billion of us, and we take up a large amount of land, not just for where we live, but also for growing crops and so forth. So as we use up more space on land, typically that's at the expense of the habitat of other species. For example, pandas in China are endangered, mostly due to land use. The habitat that the pandas live in has been reduced significantly. There is less than 2,000 pandas wild in China. Deforestation. We know the rainforest, one of the most diverse ecosystems in the world, and the rainforest is being reduced at a drastic rate for farming, for agriculture, and so forth. And therefore, as we use that space for other purposes and reduce the amount of rainforest, we reduce the number of species that can survive there. And also climate change. As we alter the Earth's climate through the release of carbon dioxide by burning fossil fuels, changes in climate means species sometimes cannot adapt to that. Species have adapted to certain conditions. If we change those conditions rapidly, that means those species might not be able to survive. So when we do cause species to become extinct, what are the effects of that? Well, as we lower the biodiversity, we just learned in the ecology section, biodiversity and the stability of an ecosystem are linked. The more types of living organisms you have in an ecosystem, the more stable it is. So if we're reducing the number of organisms, we're reducing the stability of our ecosystem. Excuse me. There's less genetic diversity. There's less ability for populations to withstand any pathogens or predators and so forth. So less genetic diversity means less ability to adapt. So how can we help to solve this problem or reduce this problem? One way is through protecting habitat. This is a common way that people try to preserve species by using refuges or national parks where there's no hunting, there's no human land use in those areas, to try to limit the loss of species. Using better agricultural practices or less use of pesticides and herbicides. Laws can help as well. Bald eagles were just about extinct in the United States after DDT started to be widely used. The Endangered Species Act protected bald eagles along with lots of other species, which makes it illegal to hunt them, which makes it illegal to develop areas in which their habitat might be negatively affected. And bald eagles have made a huge comeback in North America. They're no longer endangered at all. They're actually quite a bit more common. And also addressing climate change is going to be an important way to prevent the extinction of these species. Here's some examples. So typically, you might think of endangered species. You think most likely about these like big, sort of showy animals that we like to look at that are sort of engaging, like elephants and tigers and pandas and so forth. And yeah, all of these organisms are endangered. But for each of these sort of showy organisms that we all are probably familiar with, there are thousands of other species that we have no idea about. Things small amphibians and reptiles and and fungi that are maybe not as photogenic as, you know, a tiger or a gorilla, but the extinction of those species has just as much of an effect on the ecosystem as these big organisms that we might be more familiar with. And then the last topic for today. So one way that humans have, one reason in some areas species are becoming extinct is due to invasive species. So an invasive species is when an organism has been sort of brought into an ecosystem where it didn't natively live. Sometimes this has been done purposely, other times it's been done accidentally. When humans take a species from one part of the world and bring it to another, if that species can survive those conditions, oftentimes it can grow to an out-of-control population. Because when a species are relocated, the predators of that area did not evolve to prey on that. So if we take an organism one area, nothing is a natural predator, we lose sort of the natural checks and balances of the predator-prey relationship because nothing keeps it in check. And so if these species grow rapidly and their population skyrockets, what often happens is they start to cause the decline of native species. Native species that they're being outcompeted by this non-native organism. They're also sometimes called foreign species, non-native, imported, exotic. And so, like I said, sometimes they've been introduced by accident. For example, well, I'll talk about it in a second. Here is one that was imported on purpose. This is a plant called kudzu. It's a Japanese plant. It was actually purposely brought to the United States and planted in the middle of the 1800s, and it expanded its range drastically. Kudzu grows in these huge like blankets of very dense vegetation. This just shows the yearly cycle. This is in the winter when it's died off, but then when spring comes, it starts to spread. By summer and by fall, it has completely blanketed this entire area. This house is like an old cabin, has been completely covered by this kudzu. You see it grows up telephone poles and over wires. There's an abandoned car, it'll grow right over the top of the car and you can't see it anymore. And so this doesn't have nothing in the area. This is especially a problem in the southeast United States where organisms haven't evolved to eat that as a food source. So things aren't limiting its population, it just can grow and expand very quickly. Rabbits. In the middle of the 1800s, rabbits, 24 rabbits were brought to Australia for food. And now there are billions of rabbits living in Australia. They're a complete nuisance. They are damaging ecosystems, making it difficult to plant crops. People are trying to come up with ways of reducing the rabbit population. They grow to billions. And so here's a snakehead fish. That's one that was introduced to the United States. Some others. You guys familiar with zebra mussels? Zebra mussels came to the United States from Asia. They probably got here on ships, sailing across the ocean, or not sailing, but transversing the ocean. And as they were introduced to North America, I believe they started in sort of the Northeast. They started expanding their range through the rivers and streams into lakes and ponds and so forth. Now they're a nuisance. They damage ecosystems of lakes in the Northeast and the Great Lakes. They grow, they're small, but they grow very quickly. They reproduce quickly. They damage the water quality where they grow. They outcompete native mussels that were native to these areas. This is purple loosestrife and Phragmites, common reed. These are two plants that you see a lot around here. They are marsh plants. So, like if you're going up Route 12 in North Utica and you see the Utica Marsh in the summer, it's completely purple. That's purple loosestrife. What natively should be growing there in the Utica Marsh are cattails. Cattails are the native vegetation. They provide habitat and food for lots of different organisms. But this loosestrife was brought to the United States as an ornamental plant for people to plant in their landscape, but it's expanded since then and is taking over marshy areas. Dutch elm disease is a disease that destroyed the elm trees that used to be all throughout the United States. They used to plant them on each side of the road and they grow really large. They make like a canopy over the street, very beautiful. They've been destroyed and wiped out by Dutch elm disease. Starlings, just little black birds. They started off, a dozen were released in Central Park so that all of the birds mentioned by Shakespeare could be present in New York, and a dozen starlings grew into billions. Their habitats now throughout the entire United States. Rats are non-native, they came from Europe. Pigeons are non-native to the United States as well. So all of these organisms were introduced and have grown to sort of populations that are unmanageable and often at the expense of native species.